It's a case gone 40 years cold.
40 years later, investigators still have hope that someone can give them that missing piece of information.
The cold case heating back up in January after our report. Since then, investigators working diligently, hoping for a break in the case.
Back in 1982, we didn't have any leads. The police didn't know where to look, and there were no suspects.
Little Anne Pham was just 5 years old. On Thursday morning, January 21st, 1982, she was walking to school in Seaside, but she wouldn't make it to her kindergarten class at Highland Elementary School.
It was the morning of January 21st, 1982, and 5-year-old Anne Pham was getting ready for kindergarten. Normally, her mother or one of her older brothers walked her to school. It was only a few blocks away, but her mother always liked to be careful. On this particular morning, though, it was raining. Anne looked at her mother and asked if she could walk to school by herself, just this once. Her mother said no at first, but Anne kept asking. She was the youngest of 10 children, and maybe that made her a little more used to getting her way. Eventually, her mother gave in. She let her walk. It was a decision that would haunt the family for the next 40 years. Anne never made it to her classroom that day. Her teachers never saw her walk through the door. Nobody noticed anything unusual happen on the street. She simply vanished on her way to school, on a route she had walked 100 times before, in a small, quiet town where nothing like this was supposed to happen. When Anne did not come home that afternoon, her family knew something was terribly wrong. A search began almost immediately. Police officers, volunteers, and worried neighbors combed through the town of Seaside, California, looking for any sign of the little girl. People who knew Anne described her as a quiet and careful child. She was not the kind of girl who would wander off with a stranger, or hop into a car because someone offered candy, or asked for help finding a lost pet. Whoever took her that morning would have had to act fast, snatching her off a street she had walked almost every single day of her short life. Hours turned into a full day. Then a second day passed, and there was still no word. 2 days after Anne disappeared, an Army investigator was walking through a wooded area on the old Fort Ord Army base, checking out a tip about a possible marijuana growing operation. Instead of drugs, he found something far worse. Hidden in the brush, not far from a military shooting range, was the body of a small child. It was Anne. She had been found roughly 1 mile from her elementary school, in a place she had no reason to ever be. The news spread through Seaside like wildfire. This was not supposed to happen in their town. An examination confirmed the worst fears of investigators. Anne had been sexually assaulted, and she had been strangled to death. Someone had taken an innocent 5-year-old girl off a public street in broad daylight, hurt her in the most unthinkable way, and left her body on a military base. The police launched a full investigation. Detectives interviewed neighbors, one by one, going door to door in search of anyone who might have seen something out of place that morning. They looked into anyone in the area with a record or a reason to be suspected. They followed every lead they had. But as the days and weeks went by, nothing solid came together. There were no witnesses who had seen anything unusual. There was no confession, no clear suspect, and no answers for Anne's grieving family. Investigators knew, deep down, that somebody in that town had to have seen something. A crime like this does not happen in complete silence. But whatever that person saw, they either did not realize its importance, or they never came forward. Slowly, the trail went cold. Weeks became months. Months became years. Anne's case sat unsolved, filed away as one more tragedy that nobody could explain. While the investigation stalled, it was worth remembering just who Anne Pham really was, and the long road her family had traveled just to reach that small house in Seaside. Anne was known around her home and school as an independent, careful little girl. Every morning, she dressed herself, combed her own hair, and kept a close eye on the clock so she would never be late. She was shy around strangers, but deeply thoughtful toward the people she loved. Her older brother would later recall that if their father sat down to smoke a cigarette, Anne would quietly notice and bring him an ashtray without being asked. Her teacher described her as a bright student who showed up to class on time, every single day. Anne was the youngest of 10 children, but she was the first of her siblings to be born on American soil. Her parents, Tuong and his wife, came from a small Catholic fishing village in North Vietnam. Tuong had worked the water as a fisherman before the family's world was turned upside down. When the country split in 1954, following years of war, the entire village packed up and resettled in the south, and Tuong once again tried to return to fishing. Instead, he found himself drafted into the South Vietnamese army, where he would go on to serve for a full decade. Then, in 1975, everything changed again. As the South Vietnamese government collapsed, Tuong gathered his wife and their 7 children at the time and joined thousands of others fleeing the country by sea. The family crammed onto a 60-foot boat, carrying roughly 200 people, drifting out into the South China Sea with no guarantee of what would come next. After 2 desperate days adrift, a United States Navy aircraft carrier spotted them and brought them aboard. From there, they were taken to Guam and eventually resettled in the United States. The family first landed in Beaumont, Texas, where a local Catholic church sponsored their arrival. It was there, in 1976, that Anne was born, the very first of Tuong's children to enter the world as an American. Her parents named her after the very church that had taken them in and given them a fresh start. Work was hard to find in Texas, and Tuong longed to return to the trade he knew best. Hoping that life near the ocean would let him fish again, the family packed up once more and moved to the coastal town of Seaside, California, 4 years before Anne's disappearance. Tuong went on to become a respected figure in his community, eventually being elected president of Seaside's Vietnamese Catholic community. By January of 1982, the family had built a quiet, modest life for themselves in their adopted hometown, a life that Anne's parents had risked everything to give their children. None of that could have prepared them for what was coming. What almost nobody in the town knew was that the man responsible was living right there among them the entire time. Investigators would later learn that a man named Robert John Lanoux lived just around the corner from the Pham family. Some reports placed his home barely a 1/10 of a mile from theirs. He was a soldier stationed at Fort Ord, the very base where Anne's body was later found. He would have driven past the Pham household constantly, seeing the family's 10 children playing outside on any given day. He was never once flagged as a suspect. He blended into the background of a town that had no idea a predator was living in plain sight. For decades, he carried on with his life as if nothing had happened, while Anne's family carried the weight of losing her with no answers at all. Investigators would later discover something else that made the case even harder to swallow. One of Lanoux's own children had attended the very same elementary school as Anne, at the very same time. There was no sign that the two families ever knew each other personally, but it meant that the man who killed Anne may have dropped his own child off at that same school, on that same street, perhaps even around the same time Anne made her final walk. He was, by every account, hidden completely in plain sight. Years passed. Lanoux eventually left Seaside and moved to Reno, Nevada, but his story was far from over. In 1998, he was convicted of a crime against a minor in Las Vegas, and he was registered as a sex offender in the state of Nevada. He would go on to spend more than 20 years behind bars for sexual assault offenses. The whole time, nobody connected him to the little girl who disappeared on a rainy morning in 1982. For 4 decades, Anne's murder remained an open wound for her family and for the town of Seaside. Then, in 2020, everything began to change. The Monterey County District Attorney's Office created something called a Cold Case Task Force, a team dedicated to reopening old, unsolved murders using modern tools that simply did not exist back in 1982. The Seaside Police Department teamed up with this task force to take another look at Anne's case. The break came from a source nobody could have used 40 years earlier, a single rootless hair that had been recovered from Anne's body at the time of her death. Back in 1982, forensic technology relied heavily on DNA pulled from the root of a hair, and this particular strand simply did not have one. For decades, it sat in evidence, seemingly useless. But by 2020, science had caught up. A newer method known as forensic genetic genealogy allowed a specialized lab to perform whole genome sequencing on that hair, something that had never before led to a criminal conviction. The genetic profile was run against massive public ancestry databases. Slowly, painstakingly, a family tree began to take shape out of the results. A last name started to emerge as a likely match. Investigators followed that genetic trail, cross-referencing it with everything else they knew about the case, until one name rose above all the others: Robert John LaNue. To fund this kind of intensive, modern investigation, the Cold Case Task Force had received more than $500,000 in a federal grant from the U.S. Department of Justice, specifically meant to help solve cold cases using DNA evidence. It was this funding that made testing Anne's case possible after so many years. In July of 2022, investigators tracked LaNue down. By this point, he was 70 years old and already sitting in a Nevada jail for a parole violation, completely unaware that the case from 1982 was about to catch up with him. When detectives sat down to question him, he did not deny knowing Anne or picking her up in his car that day. He claimed he could not remember actually killing her. He suggested that he may have blocked the memory out to protect himself. He did admit, however, that he had a long history of sexually assaulting young girls. Investigators obtained a warrant, and LaNue was formally charged with first-degree murder, along with special allegations that he had killed Anne while committing a kidnapping and a lewd act against a child under the age of 14. He was held in custody in Nevada, while authorities worked to extradite him back to California to face justice for what he had done 4 decades earlier. The town of Seaside was stunned to learn that Anne's killer had been living just around the corner from her family the entire time. He had walked those same streets, seen those same children playing, and gone on to hurt other people, all while carrying the secret of what he did to Anne. For the police chief who had worked on bringing this case back to life, it was a bitter realization. If LaNue had been caught back in 1982, how many other victims might have been spared over the following decades? The case moved slowly through the courts, as cold cases involving decades-old evidence often do. But in February of 2025, LaNue finally admitted what he had done. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, kidnapping, committing a forcible lewd act on a child under 14, forcible rape, and forcible sodomy. After 43 years, Anne's family finally had the truth confirmed, directly from the man responsible. On March 20th, 2025, Robert John LaNue, now 72 years old, stood before a judge one final time. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, with an additional 31 years added on top for the rape and murder of Anne Pham. He was also ordered to register as a sex offender for the rest of his life, though by this point, that label had already followed him for decades. For Anne's family, the sentencing brought something they had waited more than 4 decades to feel: finality. They had lived through the unimaginable pain of losing a 5-year-old daughter and sister, then the agonizing decades of silence that followed, never knowing who took her or why. Throughout the entire process, prosecutors made sure to keep Anne's family updated on every single development, so that when the final sentence was handed down, it did not come as a surprise, but as a long-awaited answer. Anne's parents had fled Vietnam as refugees, rescued at sea by the U.S. Navy, before eventually settling in Seaside, where Anne was born 2 years later. They had escaped a war-torn homeland, only to lose their youngest child on an ordinary rainy walk to school, in a country they had once believed would offer nothing but safety. Investigators who worked the case called it one of the most heartbreaking cases they had ever handled, precisely because Anne had been a completely innocent little girl, doing nothing more than trying to get to kindergarten, in the same small town her family had chosen as their new home, after everything they had already survived. If you like true crime stories, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more cases just like this one. Drop a comment below and let us know what you think should happen to people like LaNue, who hide for decades before finally facing justice. And if you know of a case you think we should cover next, leave it in the comments. We read every single one.